38 weeks pregnant and struggling to breathe through sharp contractions, Naya watched her husband violently zip his leather duffel bag. He wasn't packing for the delivery room. Gregory was walking out on her for a wealthy executive's daughter, desperate to buy a seat at Chicago's high society table. He muttered a cruel insult about dead weight and slammed the apartment door, leaving his weeping wife on the floor. What Gregory didn't realize, as he stepped into the freezing rain to chase a pathetic fraction of wealth, was that his discarded wife was Naya Sinclair, and her family already owned the entire table. Naya Sterling was a master of disguise. If you saw the 27-year-old black woman walking down Milwaukee Avenue in Wicker Park, sipping a mediocre matcha latte in her oversized thrifted sweater and scuffed Converse, you would see a struggling freelance graphic designer. You would see a girl trying to make rent in a gentrifying Chicago neighborhood. What you wouldn't see was Naya Sinclair. You wouldn't see the sole heiress to Sinclair Global Enterprises, a multinational conglomerate with deeply entrenched roots in commercial shipping, luxury real estate across the eastern seaboard, and a massive stake in European telecommunications. Her grandfather had built an empire. Her father, Arthur Sinclair, had ruthlessly expanded it into a $100 billion dynasty. Naya grew up splitting her time between a sprawling, fortified estate in Martha's Vineyard, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and the family's private island in the Maldives. Her childhood was a carousel of private tutors, armed security details, and boarding schools in Switzerland. But with immense wealth came immense isolation. By the time Naya was 24, she had been burned too many times. There was the college boyfriend who secretly sold photos of her to the tabloids. There was the fiancé, hand-picked by her mother's social circle, who was caught on a hot mic bragging about merging his family's hedge fund with the Sinclair Trust. Men didn't look at Naya and see a woman. They looked at her and saw a walking, breathing ATM. They saw power. They saw a golden ticket. So, Naya ran. With her father's reluctant, heavily monitored blessing, she dropped her famous last name, moved to Chicago, and set up a modest trust allowance that barely covered a 2-bedroom apartment. She wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for the sound of her laugh, not the weight of her portfolio. Enter Gregory Harrison. Greg was a 28-year-old financial analyst from a working-class suburb in Ohio. He was white, strikingly handsome in a sharp, calculated way, with sandy blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to constantly scan the room for the next best opportunity. Greg was hungry. He worked 80-hour weeks at Caldwell and Bates, a mid-tier financial firm downtown, desperate to climb out of the suffocating mediocrity of his upbringing. They met at a rain-soaked bus stop when Naya dropped her portfolio, and Greg, rushing to a client meeting, stopped to help her gather her scattered sketches. He asked her out for cheap pizza. Naya was entirely captivated. For the first 2 years, their love story was a beautiful, gritty, urban romance. Greg loved her fierce independence, her creative spirit, and her warm, infectious energy. Naya loved that Greg had no idea about the private jets or the black cards. When he bought her a simple silver necklace for their 1-year anniversary, purchased after saving up for 3 months, Naya cried genuine tears. She locked her $2 million diamond family heirlooms in a heavily guarded safety deposit box and wore Greg's silver chain every single day. When Greg proposed on a chilly night by Navy Pier, offering a modest half-carat ring, Naya said yes without hesitation. They had a small, intimate courthouse wedding. Arthur Sinclair attended, heavily disguised in a simple suit, his private security detail blending into the background as tourists. Arthur did not like Gregory. He saw the naked, unrefined ambition in the young man's eyes, the way Greg obsessively checked the brand names of the suits worn by the senior partners at his firm. But Arthur loved his daughter. and Naya was radiant, convinced she had finally found something pure. She convinced herself she would tell Greg the truth eventually. Maybe when they bought their first house, or when he finally got the promotion he was killing himself for. She would sit him down, explain the Sinclair legacy, and they would step into her world together, protected by the impenetrable foundation of their genuine, hard-won love. Then Nia got pregnant. The timeline accelerated, and the purity of their love began to sour under the weight of Greg's insatiable ambition. By the time Nia was 6 months pregnant, the dynamic in their cramped Wicker Park apartment had shifted dramatically. Greg had finally landed a promotion at Caldwell & Bates, moving from a cubicle to a glass-walled office. With the promotion came an invitation into a different echelon of Chicago society. He was suddenly attending high-stakes charity galas, golfing at exclusive country clubs in the North Shore, and rubbing elbows with generational wealth. It was like giving a starving man a single crumb of a feast. It only made him ravenous. The man who once happily split a $10 pizza on Friday nights was suddenly obsessed with status. He started dropping thousands of dollars on tailored Italian suits he couldn't afford, maximizing his credit cards to buy a pre-owned Audi simply for the hood ornament. And then came J. Park Davenport. J. Park was the daughter of Richard Davenport, a regional vice president at Greg's firm. She was a sleek, icy blonde who dripped in casual, old money aesthetics, or at least what Greg perceived as old money. The Davenports were worth perhaps 15 or 20 million. To Naya's hidden reality, they were a rounding error. To Greg, they were gods. J. Park took an immediate, predatory interest in Greg, ignoring the silver wedding band on his finger. She started requesting Greg for exclusive portfolio reviews, which quickly turned into long, alcohol-soaked lunches at Soho House. As Nia's belly grew, carrying their unborn daughter, Greg's presence at home evaporated. When he was home, his resentment toward Nia was palpable. He began to look at her, not with the adoration of a husband, but with the critical, disdainful eye of a social climber shackled to a dead weight. "Do you have to wear that?" Greg snapped one evening in late October. Noya, 7 months pregnant and exhausted from a bout of anemia, was wearing a pair of comfortable maternity leggings and one of his old college sweatshirts. "I'm pregnant, Greg," Nia replied softly, rubbing her aching lower back. "And we're just eating takeout on the couch." "Yeah, well, J. Park always looks put together, even when she's just running errands," Greg muttered, staring at his phone, his thumb flying across the screen as he texted the exact woman he had just praised. "She was telling me today how important aesthetics are for a man's career trajectory. The firm looks at the whole package, Nia, including the spouse. When you look like this, it reflects poorly on me." Nia froze. The sheer audacity of the comment stole her breath. She looked around the apartment she secretly subsidized by paying off the landlord behind Greg's back so he wouldn't stress about the rent hikes. "I'm carrying your child," Nia said, her voice trembling, an unfamiliar edge of coldness creeping in. "I am building a human being. I'm sorry if my swollen ankles don't fit into the Caldwell & Bates corporate aesthetic." "Don't be dramatic," Greg sighed, grabbing his coat. "I'm going back to the office. Richard is hosting a scotch tasting for the senior team. I need to network." He didn't come home until 3 a.m., reeking of expensive Macallan and J. Park Davenport's signature Tom Ford perfume. The microaggressions compounded daily. Greg complained about their cramped apartment, oblivious to the fact that Nia had drafted an email to her trust manager just 3 weeks prior, preparing to buy them a $5 million brownstone in the Gold Coast, outright as a surprise for the baby's birth. He complained about Nia's lack of ambition, sneering at her freelance design work. He wanted a wife who could maneuver through high society, a wife who knew which fork to use at a Michelin-starred restaurant, a wife who could speak French to foreign investors. Nia, who was fluent in 4 languages and had dined with European royalty before she had her braces removed, bit her tongue until it bled. She was terrified. The man she loved was morphing into a monster of vanity and greed right before her eyes. The pure love she thought she had secured was disintegrating, revealing a fragile, ego-driven shell. She kept waiting for him to snap out of it, to look at the nursery they had painted yellow, to feel the baby kick and remember who he was. But the poison of ambition had already taken root. December arrived with a brutal, biting cold that swept off Lake Michigan and froze the city to its bones. Nia was exactly 38 weeks pregnant. The doctor had warned her that her blood pressure was creeping up, a dangerous sign of preeclampsia, and ordered strict bed rest. It was a Tuesday evening. The wind was howling outside their living room window. Nia was lying on the sofa, a heating pad pressed to her lower back, struggling to catch her breath through a series of intense Braxton Hicks contractions. She was vulnerable, exhausted, and desperately needed her husband. The front door unlocked, and Greg walked in. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He walked straight into their bedroom and pulled his leather duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. Nia painstakingly pushed herself up from the couch, waddling to the bedroom doorway. "Greg? What are you doing? Do you have a last-minute business trip?" Greg didn't look at her. He began throwing shirts, slacks, and ties into the bag with frantic, detached precision. "I'm leaving, Nia." "Leaving?" Nia blinked, her pregnancy-fogged brain struggling to process the words. "For how long? The doctor said the baby could come any day now. You can't leave the city." "No, Nia." Greg finally stopped packing and turned to face her. His eyes were utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a shark looking at a seal. "I'm leaving you." The room spun. Nia gripped the doorframe, her knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? I'm having our baby in 2 weeks. And I will provide for the kid. I'll pay child support," Greg said coldly, zipping up his toiletry bag. "But I can't do this anymore. I can't live in this squalor. I can't be tied down to a life of scraping by, clipping coupons and pretending this is enough for me. It's not." "Greg, please," Nia begged, tears spilling over her dark lashes, a sharp pain shooting through her abdomen. "You're stressed at work. It's the pressure of the baby. We can figure this out." "There is nothing to figure out," Greg snapped, his voice rising, venom lacing every syllable. "Look at you. You have no drive. You have no connections. I am on the verge of making a partner before I'm 32, and you are dragging me down. I need a partner who elevates me, someone who understands how the real world works, someone who belongs in my world." "And J Park does?" The name slipped from Nia's lips before she could stop it. Greg paused, a flicker of guilt crossing his face before it hardened into arrogant defiance. "Yes, J Park does. She understands the pressure. Her father is making me a VP next month. She's giving me access to a life you couldn't even dream of, Nia. A life of real wealth. You wouldn't understand." He grabbed the handle of his duffel bag and brushed past her, his shoulder colliding with hers, nearly knocking her off balance. "Greg, if you walk out that door right now, you are dead to me," Nia cried out, her voice cracking, clutching her heavy stomach. "You are abandoning your daughter. You are throwing away everything." Greg paused with his hand on the front doorknob. He looked back at his weeping, heavily pregnant wife and scoffed. "I'm not throwing away anything, Nia. I'm trading up. Have a good life." The door slammed shut. The sound echoed in the tiny apartment like a gunshot. Nia collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the physical pain in her body entirely eclipsed by the agonizing, suffocating betrayal tearing through her chest. She sobbed violently, clutching her stomach, rocking back and forth as the freezing wind rattled the cheap window panes. She had given up her safety, her identity, and her peace for a man who had just traded her in for a cheap imitation of the very life she had fled. She cried for an hour until there were no tears left. The sorrow slowly, agonizingly began to burn away, leaving behind a cold, hard, terrifying clarity. She sat up. The naive, hopeful girl who just wanted to be loved for herself died on that hardwood floor. In her place, the Sinclair air resurrected. Nia reached for her phone on the coffee table. Her hands were no longer shaking. She bypassed her usual contacts and opened a secure, encrypted app she hadn't used in 3 years. She dialed a number. It rang only once before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Miss Sinclair, it has been a long time." "Hello, Silas," Nia said, her voice eerily calm, the timbre dropping an octave, carrying the unmistakable, commanding authority of her father. "I need extraction. Wicker Park, tonight." "And Silas?" "Yes, ma'am." "I need you to run a full financial background check on a man named Gregory Harrison and a firm called Caldwell and Bates. Buy the debt, buy the leases, buy everything." Nia looked at the cheap silver necklace dangling from her neck, reached up, and violently snapped the chain, letting it clatter to the floor. "By the time my daughter is born, I want his life dismantled brick by brick. Consider it done, Miss Sinclair. A car is 3 minutes away." Less than 7 minutes after Nia ended the call, the narrow, snow-packed street outside her Wicker Park apartment was illuminated by the headlights of 3 matte-black Cadillac Escalades. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just the quiet, terrifying hum of armored engines and the coordinated, rapid movement of heavily armed private security personnel. Silas, a towering man with salt and pepper hair and a bespoke charcoal suit that hid the tactical holster beneath his shoulder, bypassed the broken intercom system entirely. He used a master keycard encoded specifically for the building, a building Sinclair Enterprises had quietly purchased 30 minutes prior, and took the stairs 2 at a time. When Silas pushed open the door to apartment 4B, he found the sole heiress to the Sinclair dynasty on the floor, breathing heavily through rolling contractions, a pool of water soaking into the cheap rug. Her water had broken. "Miss Sinclair?" Silas said, his voice a low, calming rumble that brooked no panic. He didn't look at the shabby surroundings, the peeling paint, or the snapped silver necklace on the floor. He knelt beside her, wrapping her in a heavy, heated cashmere blanket he had brought from the vehicle. "We have a medical team standing by at the Northwestern Memorial Vive IP wing. The entire top floor has been cleared and secured. Your father's jet is currently descending into O'Hare." "I can't walk, Silas," Nia gasped, gripping his thick forearm as another contraction seized her abdomen. "You don't have to, Mom," he replied smoothly. He signaled to the doorway, and 2 paramedics in unmarked, high-end medical gear stepped in with a collapsible transport chair. Within 90 seconds, Nia was out of the apartment she had called home for 3 years. She didn't look back. She left the thrifted furniture, the half-painted yellow nursery, and the ghost of Gregory Harrison behind her. The transition from Wicker Park squalor to billionaire luxury was jarring, yet it felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. At the hospital, Nia wasn't subjected to triage or waiting rooms. She was whisked through a private subterranean entrance directly into a sprawling, 2-bedroom maternity suite that looked more like a penthouse at the Ritz-Carlton than a hospital room. There were panoramic views of the freezing lake, a team of 5 world-renowned obstetricians standing by, and a chef preparing a post-delivery menu. 6 hours later, as the sun began to aggressively peek over the icy Chicago skyline, Nia gave birth to a perfectly healthy, screaming baby girl. She named her Olivia. Not Olivia Harrison, Olivia Sinclair. As Nia lay in the plush, adjustable bed, holding the tiny, warm weight of her daughter against her chest, the heavy mahogany double doors of the suite swung open. Arthur Sinclair walked in. Arthur was a man who commanded boardrooms across 3 continents with merely a glare. He was dressed in a pristine navy suit, though the subtle bags under his eyes betrayed the midnight flight from Geneva. When he saw his daughter holding his granddaughter, the ruthless titan of industry melted. He crossed the room, dropping heavily into the leather chair beside the bed, and gently stroked the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. "She is magnificent, Nia," Arthur whispered, his deep voice thick with emotion. Then his gaze shifted to his daughter, his eyes hardening into chips of obsidian. "Where is he?" Nia didn't flinch. She adjusted the silk blanket around Olivia. "He packed a bag. He left me for a woman named J. Park Davenport. Her father is a VP at Caldwell and Bates." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur slowly stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "I will have the firm dissolved by noon. I will have the Davenport family financially blacklisted on every continent. And as for the boy, he will beg for the gutter." "No," Nia said sharply. Arthur paused, looking down at her in surprise. "You promised me when I started this experiment that you would let me handle my own life, Dad," Nia said, her voice steady, stripped of all the softness Greg had taken for granted. "This is my mess. I will clean it up. Nia, you just gave birth. You are recovering. Let me crush this insect for you." "If you crush him from the outside, he just becomes a victim of corporate maneuvering," Nia explained, her eyes cold, calculating. She was her father's daughter, through and through. "He left me because he thinks I am a weight dragging him down. He left because he worships wealth, status, and power. I don't just want to break his career, Dad. I want to shatter his entire reality. I want him to look at the God he worships and realize it's me." A slow, terrifying, deeply proud smile spread across Arthur Sinclair's face. He sat back down. "Tell me your parameters." "I want Caldwell and Bates acquired by our holding company within the month," Nia instructed, resting her chin against her daughter's head. "I want it done quietly. No press releases until the ink is dry. I want Silas to intercept all of Greg's credit lines, keep them open, but monitor every cent. Let him hang himself with debt. Let him think he is winning. Let him get the promotion he sold his soul for." "And then?" Arthur asked, leaning in. "And then," Nia whispered into the quiet luxury of the room, "we invite the new VP to meet the new owner." 3 weeks later, Gregory Harrison was living what he firmly believed was his best life. He had officially moved out of Wicker Park and into J. Park Davenport's sleek, minimalist condo in the Gold Coast. The transition had been remarkably easy. He hadn't heard a single word from Nia. No frantic phone calls, no demands for child support, no hospital bills. He assumed she had retreated to some lower-income suburb to live with imaginary relatives, too ashamed and broken to fight him. He felt a fleeting second of guilt when he remembered she was due to give birth, but he quickly compartmentalized it. He would write a check eventually. Right now, he had to focus on his trajectory. And his trajectory was vertical. Richard Davenport, eager to secure his daughter's happiness with the up-and-coming shark of the firm, had aggressively pushed Greg's promotion through the committee. Greg was officially a vice president of portfolio management at Caldwell and Bates, With the title came an arrogance that bordered on delusion. Greg bought a $30,000 Rolex Daytona on a high-interest credit card, convincing himself it was an investment piece required for his new status. He and J. Park dined exclusively at places where the appetizers cost more than his old weekly grocery budget. J. Park, who had the attention span of a gnat and the emotional depth of a puddle, paraded Greg around her social circle like a shiny new handbag. "You look incredibly sharp today, babe," J. Park purred on a frosty Tuesday morning, adjusting the lapel of Greg's newly tailored Tom Ford suit in the reflection of her floor-to-ceiling entryway mirror. "Daddy says the executive meeting this afternoon is going to be massive. There are rumors flying around the whole floor." "Rumors about what?" Greg asked, checking his reflection, deeply satisfied with the man staring back at him. He looked like money. He looked like he belonged. "Mergers and acquisitions," J. Park whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. "Daddy thinks a major private equity firm from New York is looking to buy out the senior partners and inject massive capital into our division. He said if we play our cards right, you and I could be managing billion-dollar portfolios by the third quarter." Greg's heart hammered against his ribs. Billion-dollar portfolios. This was it. This was why he had cut the dead weight. This was his destiny. When Greg arrived at the glass and steel skyscraper that housed Caldwell and Bates, the energy on the executive floor was electric, laced with a palpable current of fear. Secretaries were whispering. Junior analysts were frantically updating their LinkedIn profiles. At 2 p.m. sharp, an emergency all-hands meeting was called in the grand boardroom. Richard Davenport, looking unusually sweaty and pale, stood at the head of the massive oak table. Greg took his seat near the front, projecting an air of relaxed confidence, giving J. Park a smug wink across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, clearing his throat nervously. "I will keep this brief. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Caldwell and Bates is no longer an independent entity. A controlling 92% stake in our firm has been acquired via an aggressive, all-cash buyout." A collective gasp echoed through the room. A buyout of that magnitude, executed that quickly, was unheard of in their tier of finance. "Who bought us?" one of the senior partners demanded, his face flushed. "Which firm?" "Not a firm," Richard corrected, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "A private conglomerate, Sinclair Global Enterprises." The room fell dead silent. Sinclair Global was a leviathan. They didn't just play in the financial markets, they owned the infrastructure the markets ran on. To a mid-tier Chicago firm, being bought by Sinclair was like a local grocery store being purchased by Amazon. It was terrifyingly vast. Greg sat up straighter, his mind racing with the possibilities. Sinclair. If he could impress the Sinclair executives, there would be no ceiling to his career. He could leapfrog Richard Davenport entirely within a year. "The transition will be immediate," Richard continued, his voice shaking slightly. "The holding company is sending a restructuring proxy to Chicago next week. They are hosting a private, mandatory gala at the Field Museum for the executive team to present our quarterly projections to the new ownership board." Richard looked directly at Greg. "Harrison, the new owners have specifically requested that the newly appointed VPs present the high-risk, high-yield portfolios. This is your moment. Do not embarrass us. The Sinclair family is notorious for gutting underperforming assets. They do not tolerate mediocrity." "I understand, Richard," Greg said smoothly, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "I'll have the projections bulletproofed by Friday. They won't know what hit them." Later that evening, celebrating with a bottle of Dom Perignon at a rooftop bar, Greg clinked his glass against J. Park's. He looked out over the glittering skyline of Chicago, feeling like a conqueror looking down at his kingdom. He thought briefly of Nia, probably shivering in some cheap apartment, holding a crying infant, drowning in bills. He pitied her. He really did. But the world belonged to the ruthless. What Gregory Harrison didn't know, as he sipped his $1,000 champagne, was that his entire kingdom, the firm he worked for, the building he was drinking in, and the very credit card he used to buy the champagne, was currently sitting in a digital ledger on an iPad in a sprawling Gold Coast nursery. Just 3 miles away, Nia Sinclair sat in a plush rocking chair, gently swaying baby Olivia to sleep. Silas stood quietly in the corner of the nursery, holding the encrypted tablet. "The acquisition is finalized, Miss Sinclair," Silas reported softly, careful not to wake the infant. The announcement was made at 2 o'clock. Mr. Harrison has been selected to present at the gala next Friday. Nia looked down at her beautiful daughter, brushing a soft curl from the baby's forehead. A cold, magnificent smile touched her lips. "Excellent," Nia whispered. "Send a memo to my tailor in Milan. I'm going to need a dress for a gala. And Silas?" "Yes, Mom?" "Make sure Mr. Harrison's name is at the very top of the guest list." The night of the Sinclair Global Enterprises Transition Gala, Chicago was gripped by a bitter, biting blizzard. The wind off Lake Michigan howled through the steel canyons of the Loop, but inside the cavernous, neoclassical expanse of the Field Museum of Natural History, the atmosphere was entirely insulated by money, power, and intoxicating anticipation. Stanley Field Hall had been transformed. The massive, fossilized skeleton of Sue the T-Rex, usually the centerpiece of the room, was dramatically uplit in icy blue and silver, the corporate colors of Sinclair Global. Surrounding the prehistoric behemoth were dozens of linen-draped tables, crystal champagne towers flowing with vintage Krug, and waitstaff moving with military precision, balancing trays of beluga caviar and Wagyu tartare. Gregory Harrison stood near the grand marble staircase, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. He felt untouchable. The heavy, cold weight of the $30,000 Rolex Daytona on his wrist served as a constant, physical reminder of his newfound elevation. He took a slow sip of his champagne, letting his eyes sweep over the crowd. The guest list was a staggering assembly of Chicago's financial elite. He recognized managing directors from Citadel, senior partners from Goldman Sachs's Midwest division, and even a few state senators, all mingling nervously with the sharply dressed, notoriously tight-lipped proxy executives sent by the Sinclair Holding Company. "You look like you're ready to conquer the world," J. Park purred, sliding her arm through his. She was wearing a slinky, emerald-green silk gown that clung to her perfectly maintained figure, her neck draped in diamonds that her father, Richard Davenport, had undoubtedly taken out a second mortgage to purchase for this exact occasion. "I'm not just going to conquer it, J. Park," Greg murmured, flashing his most brilliant, practiced smile. "I'm going to buy it. Tonight is the pivot." Richard said the Sinclair proxies are specifically looking for aggressive, high-yield managers who aren't afraid of risk. When I show them the tech sector derivatives I've bundled, they're going to hand me the keys to the kingdom. "Daddy is so proud of you," J. Park said, leaning in close, the scent of her Tom Ford perfume briefly reminding Greg of the night he had left Nia in that Wicker Park apartment. The thought of his ex-wife was nothing more than a fleeting, dusty memory now. She was a relic of a past he had outgrown, a stepping stone he had successfully leaped from. He had texted his lawyer a week ago to handle the divorce paperwork in absentia, assuming she was living in some subsidized housing on the South Side. "Attention, ladies and gentlemen!" A crisp, amplified voice echoed through the massive hall, cutting through the low hum of classical string music and wealthy chatter. Silas, standing at a polished acrylic podium at the base of the grand staircase, adjusted his microphone. His tailored suit and imposing, heavily scarred features made him look less like an event coordinator and more like a high-end mercenary. If I could direct your attention to the presentation area. The executive review will commence in 5 minutes. A ripple of nervous energy moved through the crowd. The Caldwell and Bates executives, including Richard Davenport, hurriedly took their seats in the front row. Greg confidently strode to the designated presenter's chair, carrying his leather-bound portfolio. He felt the eyes of the city's titans on him, and rather than shrinking under the pressure, he expanded. He fed on it. The presentation began with Richard giving a trembling, overly rehearsed overview of the firm's historical performance. The Sinclair proxies, seated at a long, elevated table across the floor, offered nothing but cold, unresponsive stares. They took notes on encrypted tablets, their faces impassive masks of corporate judgment. "And now," Richard said, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple, "to discuss our aggressive growth strategy and our high-risk, high-yield portfolio acquisitions, I would like to introduce our newest vice president, a man whose vision represents the future of this firm, Gregory Harrison." Polite, muted applause filled the hall as Greg stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, walked to the podium with the easy, athletic grace of a man who believed the universe owed him success, and connected his tablet to the massive projection screen behind him. "Good evening," Greg began, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with manufactured confidence. In a volatile market, conservative hedging is a slow death. The modern financial landscape requires a scalpel, not a shield. Over the last quarter, I have engineered a portfolio heavily leveraged in emerging biomedical tech and AI-driven logistical networks. He spoke for 10 minutes, throwing out complex financial jargon, pointing to charts that projected astronomical, albeit highly speculative, returns. He was brilliant. He was charismatic. He was completely full of himself. He didn't notice that the Sinclair proxies weren't looking at his charts. They were looking at their earpieces. "Which brings our projected fourth quarter yield to an unprecedented 19% above the industry average," Greg concluded, slamming his hand softly on the podium for emphasis. He paused, waiting for the awe, waiting for the nodding heads of approval. Instead, the massive, brass-studded double doors at the entrance of Stanley Field Hall groaned open. The heavy thud of the doors echoed like a thunderclap, violently slicing through the silence of the room. Every head in the hall turned. The security detail stationed at the entrance immediately stepped back, standing at rigid attention, their hands clasped behind their backs. The cold winter air rushed in, swirling the skirts of the socialites, as 2 more figures flanked the entryway. Then, a voice cut through the ambient noise, a voice that made the blood in Gregory Harrison's veins freeze solid. "A 19% projected yield based on over-leveraged tech assets," the voice echoed, dripping with a cold, aristocratic disdain. "That isn't a strategy, Mr. Harrison. That is a hallucination, and I do not finance hallucinations." Footsteps clicked against the marble floor, deliberate and terrifyingly slow. From the shadows of the entryway stepped a woman. She was flanked by 4 private security contractors, but she needed no protection to command the room. She wore a breathtaking, custom-tailored Schiaparelli gown in midnight blue velvet that cascaded around her like liquid night. A heavy, antique diamond necklace, the legendary Sinclair star, last seen at a royal coronation in the 80s, rested against her collarbone, catching the light and throwing fractured rainbows across the room. Her dark hair was slicked back into an immaculate, razor-sharp chignon. It was Naya. But it wasn't the Naya who wore oversized, thrifted sweaters. It wasn't the Nia who cried on a cheap rug in Wicker Park. This was Nia Sinclair, the sole heiress to a $100 billion empire. a woman who had spent the last 4 weeks giving birth, recovering, and methodically orchestrating the total destruction of the man standing at the podium. Greg's mouth went dry. His brain simply refused to process the visual information his eyes were sending it. He stared at her, his jaw slightly slack, the laser pointer slipping from his suddenly numb fingers and clattering to the floor. Naya? Here? Dressed in millions of dollars of couture? Flanked by Sinclair security? The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. The wealthy, powerful men and women of Chicago instinctively stepped back, lowering their eyes in deference to the sheer, crushing aura of old money and absolute authority she projected. Silas stepped off the stage, walking briskly toward Naya, offering a slight, respectful bow. "Miss Sinclair, the board is assembled." "Thank you, Silas," Naya replied smoothly, not taking her dark, predatory eyes off Greg as she glided toward the front of the room. "Miss Sinclair?" The name hit Greg like a physical blow to the stomach. His ears began to ring. The air was suddenly too thin to breathe. He looked at Richard Davenport, who was pale, clutching his chest. He looked at J. Park, whose eyes were wide with terrified confusion. Nia reached the elevated table where the proxies sat. As one, the 5 high-ranking Sinclair executives stood up, abandoning their chairs, and bowed their heads respectfully. The center chair, the largest, most ornate seat at the table, was pulled out for her. She didn't sit immediately. She stood behind the chair, resting her hands on the leather back, looking down at Gregory Harrison, who was practically hyperventilating at the podium. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. "I apologize for my tardiness," Naya addressed the room, her voice echoing off the marble walls, perfectly modulated, carrying the effortless command of a queen addressing her subjects. "I am Naya Sinclair, acting CEO and primary shareholder of Sinclair Global Enterprises, and I have a few questions for the man attempting to gamble my money." She slowly turned her gaze back to Greg, a smile curling the corner of her lips, a smile utterly devoid of warmth. "Hello, Gregory. I believe we have some unfinished business." The silence that blanketed Stanley Field Hall was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical, crushing weight. It was the kind of atmospheric vacuum that precedes a catastrophic implosion. Gregory Harrison stood frozen behind the acrylic podium, his knuckles bleached white from his death grip on its edges. The lapel microphone picked up the shallow, frantic rasps of his breathing, broadcasting his rising panic to the absolute elite of Chicago's financial sector. He stared at the woman gliding across the polished marble floor. Naya. His Naya. The woman who, just a month ago, had been wearing his threadbare Ohio State sweatshirt, weeping on the cheap laminate flooring of their cramped Wicker Park apartment. Now she was swathed in custom midnight blue Schiaparelli velvet, the legendary, multi-million-dollar Sinclair Star diamond necklace resting against her collarbone like a royal decree. As she moved toward the elevated proxy table, flanked by Silas and a cadre of heavily armed, impeccably dressed private security contractors, the sea of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and state senators physically parted. The managing directors from Citadel and the senior partners from Goldman Sachs bowed their heads slightly, an instinctual submission to an apex predator entering her domain. Gregory's mind violently rejected the sensory data. It had to be a hallucination brought on by stress. He looked desperately at Richard Davenport, sitting in the front row. The Caldwell and Bates regional vice president wasn't looking at Greg. Richard was staring at Naya with a pale, slick sheen of terrified sweat coating his forehead, his mouth slightly ajar. Next to him, J. Park Davenport looked like she had seen a ghost, her manicured hands trembling violently in her lap. Nia reached the center of the proxy table. As one, The 5 high-ranking, notoriously ruthless executives sent by Sinclair Global Enterprises stood up, abandoning their leather chairs in synchronized deference. Silas pulled out the oversized, ornate center chair. Nia did not sit immediately. She stood behind it, resting her manicured hands on the high leather back, her dark, predatory gaze locking onto Gregory. "I apologize for my tardiness to my own transition gala." Nia's voice echoed through the cavernous museum hall. It was perfectly modulated, devoid of any warmth, carrying the effortless, chilling authority of a woman who could buy and sell everyone in the room before her morning espresso. "I am Nia Sinclair, acting CEO and primary shareholder of Sinclair Global Enterprises, and I believe we have some business to conclude, Gregory." Gregory's throat worked frantically, trying to swallow the lump of pure terror lodged there. "Nia," he stammered, the amplified sound of his cracking voice echoing pitifully off the fossilized skeleton of Sue the T-Rex. This makes no sense. What are you doing here? This is a private Sinclair acquisition review." Nia finally took her seat, crossing her legs with slow, deliberate elegance. "Indeed it is, Gregory. As of 9 o'clock last Monday morning, Caldwell and Bates is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Sinclair Trust, which makes you, as of this exact second, my subordinate." A low, collective murmur of shock rippled through the audience. The wealthy socialites and seasoned investment bankers leaned forward in their chairs. They were wolves, and they suddenly smelled fresh blood in the water. This was no longer a quarterly projection meeting. This was a public execution. "Let us review your little presentation," Nia continued, tapping a single button on her encrypted iPad. The massive, high-definition projection screen behind Gregory abruptly flickered. His carefully constructed, color-coded growth charts vanished, replaced by a staggering, brutally detailed, red-lined ledger. "You propose leveraging $25 million of firm capital into mezzanine tranches of secondary AI-driven logistics startups," Nia stated, her tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "You stand up here and call it a visionary pivot. I call it the desperate, uneducated gamble of a man who fundamentally misunderstands market liquidity and collateralized risk. You are attempting to build a house of cards in a hurricane, using my money to fund the illusion." Gregory's face flushed a deep, humiliated crimson. The predictive algorithms from the Bloomberg terminal indicate a massive sector bounce back by Q3, he choked out, desperately trying to salvage a shred of professional dignity in front of his peers and his new fiancée. "The algorithms," Nia said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft, razor-sharp register, "are fed by the exact same flawed, ego-driven, sociopathic logic that governs your miserable personal life, Gregory. A logic entirely based on the facade of wealth, rather than the bedrock of actual value." She didn't break eye contact. "Silas." The massive head of security tapped his own tablet. The screen behind Greg changed again. This time, it wasn't a corporate portfolio. It was an unredacted, deeply personal Equifax credit report, magnified 30 feet high. "What the hell is this?" Greg panicked, stepping back from the podium as if it had caught fire. "You can't do this. This is highly illegal. This is private information." Nia let out a short, humorless laugh. "When my conglomerate acquired your firm, I acquired its debt obligations. As a standard condition of your newly minted executive employment contract, which your unchecked hubris allowed you to sign without consulting legal counsel, the holding company maintains the unrestricted right to publicly audit the fiduciary stability of its officers. So, let's look at the great visionary Gregory Harrison." Nia stood up, her commanding presence dwarfing everyone in the hall. You claim to be a master of high-yield returns. Yet this report shows your personal credit lines are maximized across 5 different Chase and American Express cards to a staggering sum of $92,000. You carry a subprime loan on a pre-owned Audi A5 that is currently 65 days past due. That bespoke Tom Ford suit you are wearing to impress my executives? Financed on a revolving Neiman Marcus retail line with a 24% APR. Scattered, mocking laughter erupted from the back rows. To the ultra-wealthy of Chicago's Gold Coast, losing millions in a bad market was a misfortune, but pretending to be wealthy while drowning in consumer debt was a cardinal sin. It was the ultimate, unforgivable embarrassment. Greg gripped the podium, tears of absolute humiliation prickling his eyes. "Nia, please, stop it, I'm begging you." "I haven't even reached the climax of your fraud," Nia spat, the polished corporate veneer finally cracking to let the raw, vengeful fury of an abandoned mother bleed through. "Do you know how you paid your half of our Wicker Park rent for the last 2 years, Gregory? When you thought your pathetic mid-level salary was keeping a roof over our heads?" Greg froze, the blood draining completely from his face. "I subsidized the lease," Nia announced to the dead-silent room, her voice echoing with absolute finality. "I paid the landlord $3,000 a month behind your back from a blind trust so you could afford to buy those cheap Brooks Brothers suits and pretend you were a master of the universe. I funded the very illusion of success you used to justify abandoning me and your unborn daughter on a freezing night. You told me I was dead weight. You told me I was dragging you down." She pointed a single trembling finger at him. "Gregory, I was the only thing keeping you from the gutter." Greg looked frantically into the audience, his eyes searching for a lifeline. He locked eyes with J. Park Davenport. "J. Park," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "J. Park, tell them about our New York merger plans. Tell them we're a team." J. Park Davenport stared back at him, her face contorted into a mask of absolute horror and revulsion. She didn't see a rising corporate shark anymore. She saw a fraudulent, bankrupt pariah who had just publicly humiliated her family in front of the most powerful people in the Midwest. Without a word, J. Park stood up, turned her back on him, and rapidly walked toward the exit, leaving her expensive emerald clutch behind on the chair. "Mr. Davenport," Nia called out sharply, shifting her gaze to Richard. Richard jumped out of his chair as if he had been electrocuted. "Yes, Miss Sinclair?" "Is this the caliber of executive talent Caldwell and Bates usually promotes? A man who abandons a 9-month pregnant woman, carries near-insolvent debt, and pitches hallucinated financial derivatives?" "No, ma'am," Richard stammered loudly, throwing his prospective son-in-law under the bus with breathtaking speed. "His promotion was a grave error. I was deeply misled by his fabrications. He does not represent the values of this firm." "I agree," Nia said coldly. She pressed a button on her tablet, and the giant screen went entirely black. "Gregory Harrison, your financial strategies are reckless. Your personal integrity is non-existent, and your presence in my building offends me. You are officially terminated, effective immediately. Furthermore, your severance package is voided due to a blatant breach of the morality clause. Sinclair Global has also purchased the debt on your credit lines and your vehicle. Silas will be legally calling in those debts in full at 8 a.m. tomorrow." "You can't do this!" Greg screamed, his carefully constructed facade shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "I earned my place. You tricked me. You set me up." "I never set you up," Nia replied smoothly, stepping away from the table and turning her back on him. "I simply handed you the rope. and I let you show the world exactly who you are. And you, Gregory, are nothing." Two massive Sinclair security guards stepped forward, seizing Greg's arms with bone-bruising force. They didn't gently escort him. They dragged him, kicking, screaming and sobbing, away from the podium, out the heavy brass doors of the gala, and threw him onto the concrete steps of the museum, into the brutal, freezing Chicago blizzard, with nothing but the clothes on his back. Nia didn't even turn around to watch him go. She simply adjusted her diamond necklace, picked up her champagne glass, and took a slow, victorious sip. The winter snow eventually melted, giving way to a bright, resilient Chicago spring. Gregory Harrison's downfall was as swift as it was absolute. Blacklisted from every reputable financial institution in the country, his assets seized, and his reputation in tatters. He found himself working a graveyard shift at a suburban logistics warehouse, drowning in the very mediocrity he had sacrificed his family to escape. He spent his nights haunted by the memory of the cheap silver necklace he had once bought, a symbol of a priceless love he had thrown away for an illusion. Nia Sinclair never returned to Wicker Park. She raised Olivia in the fortified, sunlit halls of the Sinclair estates, surrounded by genuine warmth and impenetrable security. She took the reins of her father's empire, leading with a sharp, uncompromising brilliance. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true value isn't found in tailored suits or corner offices, but in the fierce, unyielding loyalty of the heart, and heaven help the man who ever tried to cross a Sinclair again.